Happy Diwali. What is the biggest question that we can ask of ourselves today? It's what is the future of humanity? It's not a question that we can answer looking only at technology, looking at geopolitics, or looking at social affairs. We have to take everything holistically. And so, the most crucial approach is to be holistic when we're trying to understand and decipher the future. That's what we're going to try to do today. So let's start, though, with perhaps the most literal answer to the question, what is the future of humanity? Normally, when we ask this question, we retreat into philosophy, ideology, we talk about religion, maybe a big idea that we think is going to dominate the future. But the literal answer to the future of humanity is answered through demographics. We, the people. And here we actually have a very clear answer. We don't have to be particularly philosophical at all. The future of humanity is the young people of today. So the first idea I'd like to share with you, the first mega trend that is defining the future of humanity, is simply by looking at the composition of the young population of the world. And here you see it in the starkest possible terms. What is youth? Youth is the millennials, Generation Y, it's the teenagers, Generation Z, and it's the toddlers, Generation Alpha. These three cohorts add up to the world's youth, roughly everyone who is under the age of about 40 years old. And if you add up just the youth population of Asia and just India, as you can see, you have by far the largest number of young people on the planet Earth. So not only does Asia represent more than half of the world population of today, it represents an even larger share of the world population of tomorrow. So quite literally every single day, every week, every month, every year, the world becomes more Asian demographically and a bit less of everyone else. You have older populations, lower fertility rates, and therefore a higher turnover in the population in other countries. You can see it happening in Western societies in North America. You can certainly see it happen in Europe. You're seeing it also in Japan and Korea. But just the young populations of Asia, especially India, especially the Southeast Asian countries, if you add them up, you get most of the world's future population. And therefore, quite literally, the future is brown, and the future is also Asians, and wherever Asians decide to go, they take Asia with them, if you will. And so that is the next big question to tackle, is where will the Asians be, is quite frankly where the action is going to be. So I started to tackle this question about 5-6 years ago, and I wrote a book called Move, M-O-V-E. And I finished the manuscript at exactly the worst possible time you could ever have titled a book Move. It was January of 2020. The last thing that any human being in the world was allowed to do during the Great Lockdown, the only time the human species has ever fully coordinated its behavior on anything, was to stop movement. So I was in a bit of trouble with my editors. They were not very pleased. they were a bit pessimistic about the fate of this book. But I said, let's break down why, over the past 100,000 years, since humankind began spreading across the continents, why do people move? Why does anyone go anywhere? Why don't they just stay where they are? And the answer is, there's very clear structural underlying drivers that you find to a greater or lesser degree throughout history. I'll take them in a sequence. The first is the one that's very familiar to those of us looking at the economics of wealthy societies in particular today, and that is demographic imbalances, or even globally. Never in the history of the world has there been such a huge imbalance between where old people are and where young people are, both within countries and across countries. And bridging that gap between old and young so that you have intergenerational balance in a given society, so that you have enough young people who are working, who are entrepreneurs, who are taxpayers, who are laborers, who are paying taxes to finance the pension system. All of that balance. Bridging that gap is a key part of fiscal sustainability, and those demographic imbalances need to be filled. Again, today it is more acute a gap than ever in history. Let's take another perennial, epochal kind of challenge or risk or driver, and it's of course politics and geopolitics. Could be civil wars, could be international conflicts, sadly genocides, expulsions of populations. We've seen it, of course, in every century. We thought the 20th century was perhaps the worst, but indeed this century is not proving to be necessarily a whole lot better. And we see the conflicts raging in many parts of the world that is driving people to move and to relocate. Economic dislocations. When you have technological disruptions, competition, industrial policies, you have countries that are seizing the ever higher rungs of the global value chain and supply chains, rendering other places to be deindustrialized. Jobs get lost, people move, people relocate. The search for economic opportunity that every single person goes through, from birth through education, through their professional lives, that is a constant driver of mobility. Again, technology is a subset of this. When we talk about AI, so many people think about labor displacement and they assume, well, then you're just stuck. But when you lose a job because of technology, you might have to physically go somewhere else to find a new job. And we'll get into how that plays out, of course, with Indians around the world. And then there's the oldest of all forces, which is climate change. From the Little Ice Age 12,000 years ago to more recent climate volatility, disasters, catastrophes, fires, floods, droughts, all of those things also force people to move and to relocate. And then you not only have these 5 categories of drivers in overdrive today, more economic competition and technological dislocation, more political conflicts and upheavals, this huge gap between old and young, and climate change accelerating. But people thought in 2020, when COVID struck, this is the end of migration, the end of mobility, maybe even the end of globalization. It turns out that was just a blip, wasn't it? And by the end of 2022, only 2 years after COVID broke out, migration reached record levels again. It exceeded what it was in 2019, and 2019 had been the highest level in world history. And every year since then, 2022, 2023, 2024, and now 2025, we keep seeing more and more and more. So where are we today? 300 million people live outside of their country of origin. 2.6 million just professionals are relocating this year. About 150,000 high net worth individuals are changing their jurisdiction, their domicile, their residence. People are literally on the move like never before. More than 1 billion people will cross borders as business travelers or tourists, and some will return, some will not. And all of this is being amplified by another megatrend, which is, of course, connectivity. The investments that we're making in airports and shipping and all modes of transportation and connectivity are accelerating. In economic terms, we would call it the CapEx supercycle, the capital expenditure supercycle. India leads the world in the percentage of its annual budget that it's allocating to that fixed capital formation, domestically and internationally in partnership with other countries. And so, if you add it all together, you can clearly see why you cannot stop people from moving. So this tide of Asians, the force of connectivity, the drivers that push people to relocate are all very much alive, well, and perhaps stronger than ever. The data is absolutely undeniable. So let's talk about the emerging human geography of our civilization, of our species. Why is this so important? Well, again, we are reaching peak humanity, the maximum number of human beings who will ever be alive simultaneously. We're practically there already. 9-some billion people that we're approaching, and not to reach 10 billion people, ever. This is it. And most people alive, again, now and in the future, are Asians. Asians are motivated to migrate and relocate. Where are they going? Now, a lot of people, again, just as 2020 was the year of COVID and people felt that the pandemic meant that we wouldn't have as much mobility in the future, now we have populism, another pandemic of a different kind. And people say, well, this is going to suppress the movement of people. Walls, borders, protectionism, xenophobia, nativism, nationalism, fill in the blank. There's always an argument that says that borders are going to close, walls are going up. You're seeing numbers go down, yes, again. So it is a political pandemic, almost. In migration to the United States, for example, is temporarily, might even be close to zero this year, even though, of course, historically, the United States is the most open and generous to migrants. But again, think about those underlying drivers and think about where the populations are coming from and where they're ultimately going, and it's not always one place. What is this map telling us? This is the stock of intra-regional and inter-regional migration of the past exactly 25 years, since the year 2000. Let me be clear, never in the history, in the recorded history of the human species, have this many people physically relocated from one region to another region, right? I've gone back to the slave trade, the 15th century, to the age of colonialism and imperialism, in which, of course, South Asian populations, among others, were relocated across the world, looked at nationalist movements and world wars through the 19th and 20th centuries, and now today. Every single century, the decimal place keeps shifting. Not just millions, not just tens of millions, not just hundreds of millions. People are going to relocate from some place to some other place, many of them crossing borders. So there's the stock, which is primarily Asian, and there's the flow outward. Already, if you look at where the arrows are pointing, we know very well that particularly Indian populations dominate the demographic landscape of the Gulf countries. We see huge in-migration over the past 25 years, or out-migration from South Asia to all the way to North America, either by way of the Gulf and Europe first, or just straight across the Pacific. In Canada, any given year, the new migrants from India outnumber those from the next two countries combined. You have Latin Americans that have been moving in record numbers. You have Africans in record numbers crossing the Mediterranean to Europe. Focusing on the Asian vectors for a moment, let me point to two. One in particular is what you might call the new Silk Roads, right? And so many are familiar with this concept, this idea that Europe and Asia, and even Africa, that used to form this system known as the Afro-Eurasian system, the Columbian world, before the discovery of the Western Hemisphere, was effectively the Afro-Europe-Asia maritime and terrestrial Silk Road system. That world is coming back in a very big way. And so you have the Asian populations that have moved prominently into the Gulf, but now even further to Europe. I spent some time when I was a teenager living in Germany, and at the time, near Hamburg, there were very few Indians. There were very few Indian Americans. There were Turks, to the extent that there were Asian minority populations at all. And of course, everyone just thought I was Turkish, for lack of an imagination that there might be an Indian there. Go back there today, and what do you see? Go back to any part of Germany, and you're going to find a lot more Indians than were there 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago. The complexion of societies is changing so rapidly, even in the countries that gave us the notion of the nation state, the idea of the ethnically homogeneous state defined by the pure, unified ethnic group that defines that state. Almost all major economies in the world, at least in the Anglophone world, have become immigrant societies. So the term Indian American was quite common, or Asian American, but Asian European is not a term you hear at all. And yet if you go to Europe today, you see an entire generation, whether they are Indian, whether they're Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, who have now grown up in Europe, and you have this blending, this ethnic blending going on around the world. And it's also happening pushing northward. We were on a family holiday traveling through Uzbekistan a few years ago, in Kazakhstan. And who did we encounter everywhere was trainfuls, quite literally, of Indian tourist groups. When an international school opens up in Kazakhstan and they're looking for English teachers, where do they recruit them from? From India, right? And when you need a new ophthalmology clinic, when you need a dental clinic, where do you recruit your doctors, nurses, and so forth from? And going back to the point about the age gap between old and young, when you need nurses, now we commonly see in European countries and certainly in North America, Filipino nurses. But the Philippines will soon have a shortage of the number of young nurses that it can export around the world. Well, I know a country, and I think you do too, that has 10 times the population of the Philippines, right? That can train young women, young men in nursing, in elderly care, and a wide range of other professions, and circulate them around the world and send remittances back. Can you think of which country that is? Yes. So it never stops. It never stops. And this is just a taste. This is just the past quarter century. And which force is telling you that this is simply going to stop and reverse when it's just literally hitting overdrive? Now let me come back, perhaps tragically, to one of those forces and why we are in a nonlinear dynamic in the complex system of our civilization today. One of the things that's happening that is so different from centuries past is not only that rather than the world population going like this, it's plateauing and will decline, we're also facing rapid climate change. So yes, the world population is becoming ever more brown, but sadly, it's also being divided into red and green. This is a real map from scientific sources that looks at the change in the suitability for human habitation over time as temperatures rise above not just the 2-degree temperature above the industrial baseline that we're already reaching and crossing, but we may get to 3 degrees, to 4 degrees. And again, this is completely uncharted territory. And what you see is a really stark picture. Now, there's some data embedded in this that is really worrying. Because, of course, not only do we see that India itself is one of the most red geographies on this map, but let's overlay those demographics. Where are the world's young people, right? The future of humanity, we've agreed, is the young, the youth. Where are they? Primarily in countries that are red zones on this map. Is anyone doing anything about this? No, I'm afraid not. Now, we turn on the television, we follow the climate summits, the Paris Climate Agreement and targets. We're supposed to bring down emissions. Not really happening. We're supposed to reach a cap, right, on emissions, and we're supposed to control temperature rise. Not working. This is the ultimate collective action problem in the world. There is no supranational body with the power, with the authority to achieve our objectives. We are therefore on our own, in a way. Every society has to adapt. We've been focused on mitigation, right? Reducing those emissions. That is a global public good. But adaptation is a local private good, if you will. What is India going to do to adapt to this reality of climate volatility? And even if it does, or even if it doesn't, you are undeniably going to see more relocations of populations. You have domestic movement of people because of droughts and floods, heat waves, other phenomena, and then you have international migration of people as new geographies open up. And that's the link I wanted to make from the previous slide, where I said, look at that new vector of South Asian populations, not just moving across the Pacific, not just moving to Europe, not just moving to the Gulf, but increasingly you see us in Central Asia, in Russia even. President Putin has, over the years, multiple times increased the quota, the request even, that Indian farmers and other Indian professionals, construction industry and others, relocate to Russia. Other countries have made the same request to help to retool, to diversify, to stimulate their economies, their basic sectors and industries. And so, not only the economic drivers, the political drivers, the demographic drivers, now the climate drivers are yet another source of a new wave of human mobility all across borders, all across the world. And it is in the central interest of India and Indians to come up with solutions not only in terms of climate adaptation, but in terms of enabling and reducing the friction on global mobility that we all face. We live in a world where your identity is primarily defined by the state that bestows it upon you. You cannot cross a border without carrying a passport issued by a state. Passports actually were considered a feudal relic about a century and a half ago. People could move freely around the world. There was obviously lots of voluntary but also an involuntary migration. Today, I cannot think of any other country that has a greater incentive to transcend the system where we are so dependent on interstate relations and protocols and agreements and the vast bureaucracy, the over-bureaucratization of migration that we face in the world than India. Indians being the largest diaspora in effect in the world today, reaching every corner of the planet, being one of the youngest countries in the world. In any given year, India exports, in a way, more people than any other country does. It's not even worth looking at who is in second, third, or fourth place. But again, is there some higher authority that's going to solve this problem of either climate adaptation or enabling or easing frictionless mobility around the world for the global Indians of today and tomorrow? No. I think India has to be part of actually determining, generating what that solution is. I have an idea. I call it the passportal. It's a play, obviously, on the passport and a portal. And the portal is an online one. The fundamental architecture is the blockchain. You upload, you create a secure digital ID wallet. It contains your birth certificate, your financial statements, your academic credentials, your travel history, those kinds of basics that 99% of countries want when you're applying for travel and migration. And countries know that they are competing in a war for talent, that they need those young people to come in, to be their software engineers, to build their infrastructure and all of those things. Companies are recruiting for a certain set of skills in a certain place, looking for certain demographics. All of that can go on one seamless, secure portal. And then you upload your profile. This can all be done with AI matchmaking, and people can simply get, rather than waiting in line for a stamp or a visa in your passport, you should just get a QR code, and away you go. That kind of world, that kind of platform, that kind of tool, we could build yesterday. Don't expect it to simply be built for you and for someone to offer it to India and to Indians. This is the kind of application of technological ingenuity, creative policy that we need to pioneer and drive from here. And it was great to hear Minister earlier talking about DPI and the internationalization of Indian DPI. How about the globalization, creating literally a global public good out of the kind of tech stack that India has already built to enable mobility as a public good, really, for everyone who moves, which is not only all of us, but think about those future generations. Rest assured, this will eventually happen. People are going to move. The obstacles, the barriers, ultimately are overcome. They are blips. What we are talking about is the megatrend. I talked earlier about economic dislocation, political conflict, technology, demographic imbalances, and climate. And I said multiplied by the power of connectivity, that amplifies human movement. This map is not a dream. It's not a vision. This is exactly, precisely today, the map of the world. It is quite literally every highway, railway, electricity transmission line, oil and gas pipeline, fiber optic internet cable. You can put in airports, seaports. It's all here. Ask yourself, is our world really defined only by sovereign states and the borders that divide them? Or, in particularly the last 100 years, and very much today, are we in the process of building and building and building ever more connectivity? Already capital can move across the world in milliseconds. Goods and services move also at lightning speed. Logistics is improving. Only for human beings is mobility so tedious, so slow, so painful. We ourselves are the final frontier of leveraging connectivity to optimize productivity, efficiency, and ultimately human welfare. There are a lot of studies that show that if you were to simply accelerate customs clearance and processing for goods at borders that are sitting there, that could raise global GDP by 5%. But research also shows that if you simply make human mobility, especially labor mobility, frictionless, world GDP would go up by 25%. At a time when we're so concerned with achieving global growth against all of the headwinds we face of geopolitics, of trade tariffs, of sanctions, of other kinds of divisions, Shouldn't we be seizing the opportunities to grow the world economy, to increase individual and aggregate welfare, to raise productivity? Things like this are what we need to be doing, investing much, much more in connectivity. Remember that human migration, our first steps, that is the origin of globalization. So many conversations about globalization are rooted in simply counting the number of containers on the top of vessels as they transit through the Suez Canal. That is a very narrow, limited, I would say, impoverished view of what the richness of globalization is and the global story of humankind. It is very much about people, very much about ideas, and the technologies that enable their flow and circulation. I showed a map earlier of that stock of human migration of the past 25 years. In the past 25 years, we have actually had 5 major episodes where people said globalization is going to stop, it's over, it's going to reverse. The 9/11 terrorist attacks of 2001, the global financial crisis of 2008, Trump's first election and Brexit in 2016, COVID, which we spoke about earlier, and now the trade wars. Every single time, what actually happened? Globalization didn't reverse, globalization didn't stop. You have new vectors of globalization. You still have resilience in trade and capital flows. You have a huge amount of migration. So never bet against globalization. Never bet against humans seeking to achieve their full potential. Never bet against human mobility. I would say if there's one destiny that humankind actually shares, it is mobility. Mobility itself is our destiny, and it is our obligation to build the tools to make it safe, to make it smooth, to make it ethical, to make it productive. And again, no country in the world will benefit more from that system, that institutionalization of connectivity at global scale, than India. The choice is yours. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Sure. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Khanna. Can we please express a token of our gratitude here from NDTV for that stellar session?